Okay, so we're still basically on that issue of whether intelligence can be inherited or not when we talk about group differences. We have um, some explanations that focus in on inherited differences as the explanation for why groups are different. And then we have people who focus in on environmental differences that can explain why groups score differently. Okay, so now let's explain why both of those are valid interpretations for why groups might score differently. Here we have a packet of seeds that all came from the same mommy plant. Okay, so we collected all the mommy plant seeds, and now we put some of them into poor soil and some of them into fertile soil. So they started out with the same basic genetic potential. I don't know if all the seeds that come off of a mommy flower are genetically identical or not. Those of you who have taken, plant biology are sitting there going, "How do you not know that?" But I didn't take plant biology, so I'm not exactly sure if they're identical twin seeds. But they share mom's potential, right? So put some into poor soil and some into fertile soil, and you'll see that on average, the ones who are in the environment that is most facilitating end up doing the best. And the ones who have the poor soil and the less enhancing environment, they're not doing as well. They're struggling. So those are the differences that we're seeing between the groups based on their environment. But then we can also zoom in on each of those groups and see that some of the plants in the fertile soil did not do as well as others of the plants did. And you can see that some of the plants in the poor soil did better than others. And that's the variation within group that's really important. Whenever we talk about group differences, whether we're talking about racial differences on IQ scores or we're talking about sex differences on IQ scores, the variations within each of those groups that I mentioned are greater than the variations between the groups. So for example, if we talk about male versus female, there are differences between men and women that are statistically significant and probably meaningful, but within each of those groups there's a lot of variation. Women are more different from other women on average than they are from men, and men are more different from other men than they are from women. So that's one of the things about genes. I mean, you definitely have variation within the group that makes it hard to say, well, it's completely due to, men have a Y chromosome and women have an X chromosome in that position. Or if we're going to make racial differences, on average, Asian Americans score higher than white Americans, who on average score higher than black Americans. And so people look at those differences and try and explain it solely on, genetic grounds, that maybe there are inherent differences between the groups. But we can't ignore environmental differences on the groups. And intelligence tests are generally achievement tests where we're measuring what you already know. And so it's possible that the different groups have had different experiences with the content that is covered in intelligence tests. That's the problem. And so when we see differences between groups, we cannot necessarily say, well, that's how it is, and it's because, some groups have, better genes or worse genes. Instead, it's about an interaction of genetic potential and then experience with the world. And this goes back to the last lecture that, when we talk about genetic overlap, as you change how much the group shares genes, you get a change in how much we can predict their IQs from each other. As we change their overlap in their environment, we get a reduction in how much we can predict their scores from each other. So it's both genes and environment, and this dumb little picture that I've got on the screen right now is supposed to illustrate that concept. Now let's talk a little bit about sex differences. There are two clear differences in intelligence between men and women as far as skill set goes. I'll let you take a gander at the mental rotation test that's on the screen. You've got the standard on the left, and then you're supposed to figure out which of the responses are a configuration of blocks that are identical to the standard. This is called a mental rotation test because you have to do it in your head. You're supposed to imagine in your head rotating the standard, and would it end up looking like any of those responses. Men tend to be better at this task than women. They tend to be faster. They aren't more accurate necessarily, but they tend to be faster. And this is a sign that men have better spatial intelligence than women do on average. Now, there are a couple of explanations for why that's true. Um, Women tend to have a bigger left hemisphere, which is where our language centers are housed, and a relatively smaller spatial area, which is the right hemisphere. Men, on the other hand, have symmetrical hemispheres, more likely to be symmetrical. And so their right hemisphere is bigger than women's, and their spatial abilities are housed over there. So that's one theory on why men are better at mental rotation. Now, a lot of times when I report that men are better at something, it gets, women's hackles up, well, what are we better at? Let's see if I have it here. Oh, by the way, for those of us who can't mentally rotate very well, aka me, I was really offended when I found out that these kind of spatial tasks, men are better. I'm like, I'm pretty good at spatial tasks. I can read a map. I can fold a map. And I got kind of offended by it. So when I was in graduate school, I decided to do a little study on spatial skills of men versus women. And so I ordered a test called the embedded figures test. And it's like geometric shapes that are all, it looks like stained glass. It's all colored, and they're different, like triangles and squares and octagons and stuff all embedded in the figure. And then you're supposed to find a figure that overlays and crisscrosses some of those lines, and recognize that there's this it looks like a horse that you would have made out of Legos or something embedded in there, right? You're supposed to find it. So I thought, oh, this is going to be fun, because I'm going to show that modern men and modern women scored, the same. So I order the test. Well, it comes to me in just the black and white outlines. This was back in the olden days of like 1992, and color printing was unheard of and too expensive. So they don't send it to you already colored. You order it, and then you have to color it in with felt pens. So I sit down to start coloring the different geometric shapes and getting my stimuli ready. And I discovered that I couldn't even find, it would tell me color this one yellow, and it would be over here on the right side. So I'd go look over at the embedded figure trying to find that structure to color yellow, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't even find the things that I need to be coloring. This is horrible. But I still didn't think it was necessarily a sex difference. I thought maybe I'm just getting tired. This is, maybe this shape is just hard to find. So my husband comes home from work. He goes, what are you doing? Because, here I am working on a PhD and I'm coloring, right? And so I said, well, I'm coloring this embedded figures test, but I cannot find this object in this figure. And he goes, it's right there. He didn't even like blink. He took a glance, and there it is. And I was like, hold on, I've been staring at this for 20 minutes. How'd you find that? So then I put him through a couple more, and yeah, he was way better. And I realized being able to read a map does not necessarily mean that you've got the greatest spatial skills. It just means that you can read a map. And he did it so effortlessly. Now, one of the problems that women have with mental rotation tasks is that we talk our way through it. Our big left brain says, well, let's see. The standard has that one little sticky outy part, and it's made up of 3 squares. Let's look and see if this one has a sticky outy part made of 3 squares, right? And so then we look for it. And that's, we say, well, that one's pointing upwards while the other one's pointing backwards. So if I rotated it, then that one would be pointing backwards while that one's pointing forwards. Let's see, is that there? We have like all these words we say, whereas men just look at the shape and oftentimes report not thinking any verbal thoughts while they were attempting to do it, and that's part of why they're faster. Now, don't worry, women. We have our skills also. Women far outstrip the average man on linguistics tasks. So you're supposed to unscramble the words, and believe it or not, I got this from a kid's set of stimuli, and there's one that I could not figure out to save my life. I must have gotten some kind of mental set and just kept trying the same strategy over and over again and just could not come up with it. If I give you a hint that it's ingredients from a recipe, that might help you. But I went ahead, for those of us who struggle with these things, and put it in. Women tend to be better at tasks like this, unscrambling nonsense, anagrams into words, finding words in a word jumble. You know, a little, what are those things called where it's all the letters are organized in a square and you're supposed to circle the words that are embedded in there. Women are better at that. Women are better at generating a list of related words. If I said, you know, name as many examples of cookies as you can think, since we got a recipe here, and you start naming off chocolate chips, snickerdoodle, all these different, you know, shortbread, whatever you start naming off. Women are much better at generating names of things, lists of things, anything having to do with language. Women are better, and that's largely due to our left hemisphere being bigger on average than men. We have bigger language centers. A lot of these skills are really adaptive if you think about what historically men and women have done over the course of human history, right? Men have had to go out into the environment and find their way back, so they better have pretty good, you know, internal GPS. They are good at throwing sticks and things like that because they've been hunters, and you know, their bodies have developed to accommodate that. So spatial tasks that involve imagining the world in 3 dimensions have been critical for men over the history of humankind. For women, the skills that have been really important are those skills that allow us to maintain the goodwill of our peers so that we have a better chance of getting our children into the future. If I can get my cave mates to help me collect seeds, or help me watch my child while I go do, you know, something that requires me to climb down this little outcropping or whatever, my child has a better chance of making it in the future. And what better way for women to build goodwill but to be able to talk and communicate with their peers. Also, I think I already mentioned in an earlier lecture that the idea that language might have emerged from women communicating with their babies. And so it wouldn't surprise us that women are better at language if that's true, that women, and you know, made it up as a way to communicate with their babies. So men on average are better at spatial stuff. Women on average are better at linguistic things. Interestingly enough, about the normal distribution of intelligence in the population, men tend to be overrepresented in the extremes. They are much more likely to suffer from something called Fragile X syndrome that can cause mental retardation, where you're going to be down below the 70 IQ points. And they're much more likely to be in the highest levels of IQ. Women are much more likely to cluster in the normal range. And so when we say that men and women don't differ on average on their IQ scores, it's because if you average out those highs and lows that men carry, it comes out to an average score that's very similar to this clustered pattern that we see in women that's right around the average anyway. So yeah, men and women don't differ on average, but they do definitely have different skill sets. Okay, that is enough on Chapter 9. I will see you back here for Chapter 10.